You've probably seen images like this, and this over the past couple weeks. But is that really an accurate representation of these protests? And also, what caused all of this in the first place? We're going to take a look at why these protests are happening, what actually happened day by day, and just how much violence was there from both sides. We can start by looking at our first question. Why did these protests kick off in the first place? The simplest answer is, well, deportations. The spark that ignited these protests was sightings of immigration officers in parts of LA that are very Latino and immigrant. But it's more complicated than just people disagreeing with deporting those who immigrated to the US illegally, although that is the stance of some. But tensions have been growing all over America regarding the way the Trump administration has been handling immigration, with reports of people being detained by ICE agents whilst at their immigration hearings, children being deported, and perhaps most concerningly, people being deported without due process. For anyone who doesn't know what due process is, it is basically the idea that you have to be given a trial in the event that you are accused of something. For instance, being illegal. This has already led to multiple US citizens being deported, and some people have brought up that when due process isn't given to one group, then realistically nobody is guaranteed it, because the government could just claim you're an illegal immigrant and then you wouldn't be given the due process to prove that claim incorrect. As you can probably imagine, dictatorships have used this before to just deport or even imprison political enemies. And some people fear that that is the direction that America is currently heading. So that's all the why, but what actually happened at these protests? And when did it become like this? The first day of the protests, June 6th, after word spread about ICE raids in downtown LA, a crowd of protesters gathered there A, to voice their objections to these raids, and B, to make it harder for ICE to actually execute them. They eventually made their way to the LA Federal Building, which was being used as a detention center for those detained by ICE. And everything up until now was peaceful. But as the demonstrations continued into the night, there were reports of vandalizing property, and by the next day, rocks had been thrown at Border Patrol and police vehicles. On this second day, protesters also blocked Highway 101 with the idea that a protest has to cause some amount of disruption in order for you to be heard by those in power. And so police deployed smoke, tear gas, pepper balls, and even flashbangs in order to disperse these crowds. But then, on only the second day of protests, Trump made the controversial decision to federalize the National Guard and sent 2,000 of them to guard the federal building in LA. But what does federalizing the National Guard mean? Well, the National Guard is a state-based military force, and federalizing them means temporarily placing them under the president's control. This usually comes at the request of a state's governor, but that isn't necessary in extreme circumstances. Which begs the question, were these circumstances extreme enough? Well, California Governor Gavin Newsom and many others don't think so. In fact, he filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration for this exact thing. And then, after having already sent the National Guard, Trump also sent 700 Marines, which is of even more dubious legality. But all of that is way out of my depth, so if you want more information, you can check out this Legal Eagle video that will be linked in a pinned comment. Anyway, back to the protests. Sunday, June 8th is when protesters would call up self-driving taxis in order to set fire to them after they arrived. Why? Well, self-driving taxis have a lot of cameras around the exterior so that the car can gather all the data it needs to be able to drive effectively and safely. But that data is stored, and law enforcement can and has requested that data when a self-driving taxi's cameras have witnessed something like a crash or even a crime. And all of that makes total sense, there's no problem with that. But there are fears of the possibility that if one or multiple of these cars was near a protest, they could be used by the government to spy on or even track and hunt down protesters if Trump decided to become a dictator, which is a scarily common belief nowadays. Some people have also said it was an act of protest against how big tech companies as a whole have already been aiding the Trump administration with the surveillance of immigrants, like for instance Palantir. Once again with the idea that once something can happen to one group of people, it can eventually happen to everyone. Once again, if you're interested in everything to do with these self-driving taxis, you can watch this video which goes into more depth, also linked in a pinned comment. The night of Monday, June 9th would see looting take place overnight, where 23 businesses were looted, both big and even small businesses. This led to a curfew to be put in place in downtown LA.
That I have declared a local emergency and issued a curfew for downtown Los Angeles
from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. And by June 13th, over 500 arrests had been made related to the protests, with 30 individuals charged, those charges ranging from violations of curfew all the way to assault, vandalism, and looting. After the curfew was put in place, things slowly started cooling down, which meant that by June 17th, it could be lifted, a week after it was first implemented. I'm writing this on the 18th, and from what I can tell, nothing eventful or violent has happened since then. So, just how violent were these protests? Were they mostly peaceful with a few bad apples? Or was it an insurrection, like a certain someone claimed? Spoiler, it wasn't an insurrection. 5 burned cars is actually considered a pretty peaceful day in somewhere like France. In fact, that curfew I mentioned that was put in place because of the violence occurring was only 1 square mile of downtown LA. To put that into perspective, LA is 500 square miles. If your screen was the size of LA, this red square would be the area where the curfew was in effect. So the majority of the violence was concentrated in this small part of the city. So yeah, not an insurrection by any means. I also found this graph from the ACLED, or Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. This graph is all the immigration-related protests since the start of the year, up until just before the LA protests started. As you can see, orange represents a peaceful protest, and the graph is pretty orange. This doesn't, however, include the LA protests specifically, but even if they were violent, the idea that protests as a whole are mostly peaceful with the occasional bad apples does seem to hold up. What about the LAPD? Were they violent? Did they de-escalate situations as they arose, or did they in fact instigate situations? Well, I couldn't find any hard facts or numbers about this, but I thought it was worth mentioning anyway, because I saw a few clips like this one where a police officer just randomly shot at a reporter with a rubber bullet, not a real one, but still. Or this clip where it looks like police tried to make their horses trample a man on the ground. So I'll leave you to form your own opinion about how often this kind of thing takes place. Now that we've covered the why, the what, and the violence, did these protests actually achieve anything? Well, a lot more people are now talking about this topic as a whole, and this poll found that a slight majority of voters now disapprove of Trump on immigration and deportations, which used to be his strongest issue. I'm midway through editing this video, and I just found out that the LA Dodgers apparently denied ICE entry into their stadium, of which it is very possible that decision was made at least partly because of these protests, so that's interesting. On the other hand, however, overall perception of these protests is seeming to be negative, likely due to the news coverage of burning cars and rocks being thrown at police, as that imagery does tend to sway people. That is about all I have for this video. This is actually the first video on the channel, so if this is the kind of content you want to watch, please consider subscribing, and also let me know any other topics you might want me to cover in the future.